Hi friends, and welcome to Fantasy Awash. Today we are going to be doing something a little bit different. I am going to be taking you on a journey as to where to start your adventure of learning about ancient Greece, be it through primary sources, modern sources, plays, philosophy, and architecture. I'm going to be doing this deep dive with you today so you know exactly where you need to go for the information that you want to find. Some of you may know me just as Fantasy Awash, others know me as Laura. I am a former academic, having completed my Master of Arts in Classical History. Even though my specialization was Roman history and Roman religion and Roman archaeology, I have a very large spot in my heart for all things Greece, especially ancient Greece, especially because that was my preliminary path of study and before transitioning over into the Roman world. So we are going to begin with the very beginning as to where I believe you should start if you are wanting to read about Greek mythology and the best places to look. Let's jump in. If you ever took an intro to mythology class in college or university or looked on things online, there's a good chance that you probably have heard of my first person that I'm going to mention, and that is an individual by the name of Hesiod, and specifically his works called The Works and Days. This takes us through the beginning of creation, how from chaos the world emerged, from the void life was created, the story of the gods, the battling on Olympus versus the Titans, the creation of Pandora and her box. This is a wonderful place to start if you are looking for the origin point of Greek mythological telling. Hesiod's work is not the oldest that we have, but it is fairly old and it is quite conclusive, and many other ancient authors and storytellers ended up using that as their starting point. Therefore, that is a good basis for us to use it. If other primary sources are citing older primary sources, that's always a good thing. Primary source being that it was written by someone who lived during that time period. Obviously, we don't have 100% primary sources for when the Greek gods came into existence, because let's be real, in our modern day and age, most people believe that these gods weren't real, but those who lived in ancient Greece at the time very much held the belief that these were real people hailing from Mount Olympus, many of them still living there, and that a war between giants and Olympians had taken place, and it was one for the ages. If you want to continue with the Greek mythological stories, then a great place to go is to the Iliad by Homer. This version that I'm holding up is translated by Emily Wilson. This is probably the best translation that is available to date. There have been countless translations that have been made throughout the years, the most notable being Fagles and Fitzgerald. I would say that Emily Wilson is the one that I would recommend to most people. It is the most accessible, most approachable in terms of language. It does not feel like a daunting book to read. And then that also leads into the Odyssey, which I would also suggest having the translation by Emily Wilson. Of course, the Iliad takes us through the story of the Trojan War, in which the story is based on the kidnapping of Helen of Troy and a massive war that emerges between the Greeks and the Trojans. The Trojans having believed to have been based in Asia, modern day Turkey, and of course the Greeks being from Greece, and of course tells of the great story of the hero Achilles, all the while meeting characters like Patroclus, we meet Odysseus, there's Ajax, Agamemnon, there's just so many wonderful characters in this book, but people don't necessarily realize that the Iliad is deeply rooted with the intervention of deities and gods. That is the driving force of the story, so it's a highly enjoyable read. For me personally, my preference between the two is the Odyssey, which is almost a continuation of the Iliad, except it is 10 years later, 10 years after fighting the Iliad, and it is the journey of Odysseus to get home, which takes him 10 years because once again, we are dealing with godlike intervention, and that comes from a plethora of different sources. Along the way, you meet different mythological creatures, beings, you get to see magic being used by them, how these people work, how gods intervene, and how often it is not for the better. In terms of looking at our original sources, primary sources, of course, if you can read it in the original language, it's always going to be advantageous for you, because no matter what, we always miss things in a translation. But if you are someone who doesn't read ancient Greek, which, let's be real, that's the majority of people, then I would highly suggest Emily Wilson. I think she's a great starting point. Of course, there are other characters and people we need to mention in terms of our primary sources. And this is where we're going to kind of jettison into plays. Greek plays, specifically Greek tragedies more often than not, often deal with mythological characters. This is a great example. This is called the Four Plays. It's Grief Lessons, the Four Plays by Euripides. Euripides was a tragic playwright, and most of his stories and works have to do with mythological figures. If we open up to the table of contents here, where the first play is Heracles, we then have Hecabe, Hippolytus, and Acestes. So I think Euripides is a really great place to start if you're wanting to get a little bit more background and context on characters that you might not necessarily know or understand. Euripides wrote The Trojan Women, which is a really great story to read, especially if you have read the Iliad. It gives the context for the survivors of the Trojan War and what that was like from the perspective of women, because let's be real, men were the ones that were off fighting the battles while the women were behind the supposed walls of Troy, not being able to participate, do anything, and just see their loved ones being slaughtered, all the while then becoming slaves and the conquered themselves. It really puts you in the mindset of someone who has suffered and is continuing to suffer, and it is a beautifully written work. It's something that I highly encourage people to read, but it is not my favorite play by Euripides, which you will see by the million tabs here, and that is the play of Medea. Medea is a witch who is married to Jason from Jason and the Argonauts and Jason and the Golden Fleece. As you might be noticing, all of these stories are somewhat connected, and I feel like it is a really great play. I love it so very much. It really gives us an insight as to how the ancient Greeks viewed women with magic. If it wasn't apparent, if you read Hesiod, he's kind of a misogynist, and Euripides also very much a misogynist, but it definitely helps you understand the mindset of how men of the agora and men who were of the upper echelon in ancient Greek society in Athens, specifically Athenian society, really looked down upon women. Medea is an excellent read to understand what's going on there. Now, this is an anthology, and it is the best one that I have come across thus far. I have to say, I absolutely love this. It's called The Anthology of Classical Mythology, Primary Sources in Translation. This one I will have specifically linked in the bottom is by Transcoma, Smith, and Brunet. I love this anthology because specifically it really takes you through a period of time with characters that change dramatically from their onset to characters that we have come to know in a very specific way. The best example that I could give would be of Dionysus. Dionysus in the original Linear B tablets where he is mentioned is not this god of wine or parties or bacchanalias or anything along those lines. He is a very simplistic god, but his image changes over time. And this anthology really can show you, because it dates the sources that it's quoting. It tells you on what source they were written on. Was it written on a clay tablet? Is it presented on pottery? Is it on a stele, or is it on a slab? Is it on, actual writings of papers and documents that have been found? This is a wonderful compilation of really seeing the evolution of characters in mythology, especially if that is what you were wanting to know, learning to understand them, really getting into the mindset of these characters, especially people that you might not necessarily know a lot about. And also, one last thing to mention, that Hesiod's work and days is in this book, so it's kind of a 2-for-1 if that was something you were wanting to do. In terms of another modern day source that is a great recounting of classical mythology being the classical period of Greece, which is around the year 425 BCE to the year 400 BCE. Some people go a little bit further and lower. It kind of leads into the Hellenistic period where Alexander the Great became very prominent within Greece. This is a wonderful compilation. This is by Oxford University Press. It is Mark Morford and Linarden and Sham. This one I really loved. I taught this book. It not only gives you wonderful maps, which is not super clear right here, but it gives you images of pottery. It gives you context setting, the story, what's going on politically at the time. It's a very encompassing book, and I feel like even though it is an academic book, it's not one that's going to bog you down and feel too complicated to understand for a person that's maybe not as versed in the classical world as an educator would be. I think that this is a wonderful starting point, and I highly recommend that in terms of mythological reads. One more thing I wanted to say in terms of playwrights that I really love, just to kind of throw that out there. I would really love people to read the plays by Sophocles, specifically Antigone. I think Antigone is a wonderful play, and it is something that I think if you're interested in the ancient Greek world, you definitely should be checking out Antigone. Now I'm going to transition a little bit into ancient philosophy and some of the history, because these are often very interchangeable in that philosophical schools were the schools in ancient Athens. Specifically, there was a school for Socrates, then Plato, then Aristotle's school. But my preference of the three has always been and will always be Plato, because you get a very good understanding of Socrates from Plato. Socrates really didn't write much down himself. It was those around him who took those notes. So I always love suggesting the Penguin Classics for Plato, The Republic. I love this story. It has some really great anecdotes in it. But my personal favorite is Plato's Symposium. This is more of a story, but it is a conversation of the high-ranking philosophers in Athens gathered for a dinner party where they each discuss what love means. And this is a wonderful book in terms of understanding how relationships worked in ancient Greece, specifically, once again, Athens. It really is very eye-opening in terms of how the majority of the people there feel like you cannot experience true love if it is with a man and a woman. It has to be a man and a man. How soulmates are often androgynous beings, how they've been separated into two different bodies. It's wild. This is a really, really fun read. I highly recommend it. In terms of reading kind of more introductory level for more philosophy, I would recommend The Great Conversation, Volume 1. I'm sure that this has been updated since I bought it. This is the 5th edition that I used. It is by Norman Melkert. I really loved this book. This one actually goes from pre-Socratic philosophy to Descartes. But if you are looking for an introduction to ancient philosophy and getting into the mindset of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and many others from that time period, I'm just naming them because they are the most well-known, then this is a really great starting point. Jared Henderson also has a philosophy channel. I'm not sure if he has done anything on ancient Greek philosophy, but if you are looking for more specific things, I'm happy to talk to you through that, but he also might be a really good starting point for you. Now, in terms of history books, if we're wanting to once again look at primary sources, one of the books that I have here is Arian, and that is The Campaigns of Alexander. I personally don't love Alexander the Great. I find his story to be rather redundant because it's just been retold so many times. I think that the tale of his father, Philip of Macedon, is exceedingly more interesting. But Arian lived during the Roman period, but is from Athens in Greece. He had access to scrolls, materials, works, primary sources that we no longer have and no longer exist. If you are someone that is interested in the Alexander period of Greece, I think this would be a really good starting point for you. But if you would like to go back even further, in terms of contemporary modern sources, this is The Aegean Bronze Age by Cynthia W. Shelmerdine. And this, I will say, is a dense read, but it really helps set the world for Bronze Age Greece. Bronze Age being around the years, I want to say 1300. It's, like 3000 to 1100, 1300 BCE. It is quite a ways ago, but this book does a really wonderful job of telling you what's going on the islands of Crete and what's going on the mainland of what was Hellas that then became Greece. It gives you instances of looking at writings, markings, the beginning of writing, linear B, linear A, which is a highly interesting topic. It also takes you through the evolution of pottery, just the evolution of humans really in this part of the world. So if you are interested in the Bronze Age and you're interested in ancient studies, this is a modern source that I would definitely recommend to you. Last but not least, in terms of ancient historical writings that I think if you want to learn about the history of ancient Greece, that would be Herodotus, the Histories. Herodotus is a really interesting figure because so much of what he wrote has actually been disproven, but it is so great to read, to see what people believed at that time. Herodotus was one of the few Greeks that actually traveled quite extensively and then made up quite a few things along the way. So if you're looking for an idea of what people perceived the world to be through the eyes of Herodotus, I definitely recommend checking it out. Of course, there are countless other primary sources that can help you fill in these gaps. If you are looking for direct primary source translations, I highly recommend checking out the Classical Loeb collections. You can also subscribe online to Harvard's Classical Loeb Library. I think that that is a great place to start. Last but not least, I want to talk very briefly about classical archaeology. The books that I use are Greek Art and Archaeology by John Griffiths Pedley. This is the 4th edition. I know that this has been updated countless times, but I love this. It takes you from the Bronze Age up until the end of the classical period into the Roman period. I also have Robin Osborne here, Classical and Archaic Greek Archaeology. So that's taking us from around 800, 900 BCE up until about 400 BCE. This one, of course, includes the building of the Parthenon, the Agora, the Acropolis, all that fun stuff. It's a really great read. And if you're looking for another one, it's the same author as the first one, John Griffiths Pedley. It's Greek Art and Archaeology. He's my personal favorite in terms of making it accessible and an introductory level for understanding everything there is to know about Greek art and architecture. Let me know in the comments below if you would like any more recommendations or places to start, if you would like me to do another video perhaps solely on plays, a specific aspect about ancient Greece. I plan on doing something similar for ancient Rome. If there is a time period that you would like more so than the others, please let me know. Let me know what you love about ancient Greece and the ancient world in the comments down below. If you would like to help support the channel, you can always hit like and subscribe. And as always, thanks, and I'll see you next time. Bye.